much, Mia. And I would like to welcome Laura Forlano, who is our next speaker. Let me introduce Laura. I know her personally. We've known each other for a very long time. She's a Fulbright award-winning and National Science Foundation funded scholar. She's a disabled writer, a social scientist, and a design researcher. She's a professor in the Department of Art and Design and in Communication Studies in the College of Arts, Media, and Design at Northeastern University, as well as a senior fellow at the Burns Center for Social Change. Laura is also an affiliated fellow at the Information Society Project at Yale Law School. And today we will talk about her book, Cyborg. I should also mention that the book has a co-author, Danya Glabau. It was published in 2024, last year, so hot off the press still, by MIT Press Essential Knowledge series. So those tend to be small books. They're really small in size, and introductory texts that explain relatively complex ideas to a non-technical, kind of a lay audience. And so her book, Cyborg, is one of those in the series, and it interestingly talks about this idea of the cyborg, which you may associate with, sci-fi movies. We've seen some tech companies already trying to create something like what we've seen in those sci-fi movies. I think there's this famous example from already 9 years ago, 2016 was one of the cyborgs that was created for the South by Southwest Festival was Sophia, and she was also the first robot to gain citizenship in Saudi Arabia, which happened a few years after that. So you might have that as the image of the cyborg in your mind, but I think Laura is definitely not talking about that kind of cyborg, and is actually actively arguing against that idea of a cyborg like that. And so my first question to you, Laura, is what is a cyborg, and how did you come up with the idea to write about it?
Sure. Thank you so much, Atlanta. It's great to be here. And yes, to answer your first question, I mean, it is really important to foreground the original term cyborg, which was actually from a 1960 paper by Manfred Klein and Nathan Klein. And this was about preparing the human body to live in outer space. So this idea that by embedding, machines in the body to administer medications or make the human a system that could survive in harsh environments. That these sort of technologies were being experimented with, and they were being experimented with both in this setting of thinking about outer space. Actually, the original concept was published in an astronautic journal. But also, these researchers were doing work in psychiatric institutions in upstate New York, and they were administering, drugs through these embedded technologies. So, it's important to notice that because the cyborg, the original concept it's obviously, coming from this context, which is highly militaristic, and related to, again, like mental health and the control of populations in psychiatric institutions. That's obviously a very problematic starting point. But what happens with the concept and with the idea is that it is sort of reclaimed by the scholar Donna Haraway and taken up in her Cyborg Manifesto as both a critique as well as a generative engagement. So one of the things that Haraway does in her work is to both acknowledge some of the ways in which we want to continually critique technology, such as so many of the arguments that have been presented earlier today, while at the same time seeing technology as potentially a generative force. And I think really looking to helping us think through the kind of possible futures that might be desirable from a feminist technoscience perspective. And then what Danya and I do in this book is to try to, of course, engage with this feminist version of the cyborg, but also to expand it and extend it. So Haraway's work has been also critiqued by for example, using the bodies of, let's say, non-white, non-Western women as an example of kind of cyborg labor, this idea that there are people like working, around the world in these contexts. And that's one critique, let's say, that has to do with race and colonization. And then the other critique that we try to foreground is around disability. So in a way, the cyborg makes a lot of sense as a concept to those of us who are disabled, and I identify as a disabled scholar, especially in my case, using the technology that are sensor systems and insulin pumps that I use for managing type 1 diabetes. So the idea of the cyborg, even the science fiction version, is quite familiar in some sense. And but at the same time, Haraway doesn't necessarily go into any of those cases in detail. And so they're kind, you could say that disabled people are kind of used as a figure that's somehow related, but not really engaged with in particular. So that's been another critique. So there are a number of disabled authors that, really resist and really dislike this use of the cyborg to talk about disability, but others that really embrace it and find it very generative. So in fact, the poet and writer Gillian Weisse says that that most people, who say, well, I'm a cyborg because I have glasses, or I'm a cyborg because I'm using, a smartphone, that Gillian believes that that is an incorrect use of the term, and that if we're talking about people who are just kind of using these technologies as like part of their quantified self or their health regime, that those people are triborgs, she says, or they say. So that's the idea. So I
Yeah.
think that's to give you a bit of trace, like the origin story for the cyborg, the sort of feminist technoscience, second wave feminism version, and then sort of where we're trying to go with this concept in the book.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was gonna, ask a little more about these things. So if you don't mind, I
Sure.
will anyway.
Yeah.
And, I want to quote something from the book, which is, I think a very good way of kind of starting these sorts of conversations about what exactly is a cyborg, and how do we think about those kinds of questions of feminist critique of technology, which have decades of history already. So you say cyborgs have a troubled past, lively present, and most likely long future in both real and imagined worlds. And so you come up with the terms cyborg thinking and critical cyborg literacy. And I think your discussion really is about cyborg thinking and ways of thinking about technology and society rather than who should be called a cyborg and what exactly is a cyborg, right? Which is the productive line of discussion here. And so I appreciate that you situated this already in the kind of feminist literature that has existed so far. And I would like you to talk a little bit more about the feminist critique of technology, right? And it kind of has gone towards both poles, right? Towards both having a lot of hopes, especially in the 70s, with women doing a lot of domestic work, hoping that these technologies will relieve them from this kind of domestic work. Towards, then in the 80s with Donna Haraway and her essay, which is very much informed by, kind of the Cold War and imperialism and workers and labor rights and that sort of question. And now today, where we have the third wave of feminism, and we're kind of perhaps swinging a little bit between utopia and dystopia in technology critique and technological thinking. So I am wondering if you can formulate for us what is the idea behind cyborg thinking, and how do you continue in this tradition of feminist technology and feminist critique of technology?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the basic definition that we give in the book is that a critical cyborg literacy foregrounds power dynamics. So we really look at the ways in which the social and cultural factors, such as gender, race, and disability, as well as the intersections of these things, shape the kinds of technologies that are imagined, developed, used, and resisted. So it is a both critical and creative expansion, and it really seeks to tell alternative stories about technology and humans. And I think, with respect to this topic of AI ethics, which is being centered today, I think, one thing that's interesting, and I know that many of the speakers earlier today have probably mentioned this and also share some of these approaches. But when we talk about AI as a thing in itself, it often means that we're ignoring or removing the socio-technical or the cultural context. And so a cyborg approach definitely sees both the technology and the context as like intimately joined. And so that's one thing to mention is that, in our mainstream accounts about what technology is, we are often assuming ideas about agency that think of technology as some kind of discrete unit that acts onto the world. And in a feminist approach, we're really trying to look at the ways in which, technology is entangled with the social world in many ways. And so that's specific to work contexts and work settings. So I think in order to take a cyborg literacy approach, one has to already reconceive of what is technology as a starting point, even to then go into discussions of power relations, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fantastic. And this is great for my next question, which is where you go next in the book. I think you take the world of work as one of your areas of discussion, and it very well maps to this sort of utopian dystopian thinking, right? On the one hand, a lot of people are saying, oh, there's a lot of potential benefits there. It will save us from grudge work, and it will deliver services cheaper and faster. On the other hand, yes, lots of unemployed people will have that because of these technologies exploiting people and kind of race to the bottom, as it is known for, lowering and lowering the wages. So you take the case of Amazon as an example of discussing the future of work. So can you walk us through that case and tell us a little bit more about your discussion there?
Sure. And in this case, we look specifically at, as one example, robotic warehouse work. And, based on New York Times reporting that was done in 2019, that took a very detailed look at Amazon warehouses. And in particular, just a quote from one of those articles, from the worker's perspective, Amazon has an obsession with optimization of these fulfillment centers because we're trying to, according to the company, trying to achieve a world of one-day delivery, and that requires a lot of these new routines, rules, and metrics. So that's from the New York Times, and also the job titles that are at least at that time, were, common in these warehouses were things like pickers, stowers, and water spiders and packers. So like these new kinds of job roles that are specific to the warehouse. And one of the things that New York Times reporting talks about is the ways in which the safety of humans, actually, when it comes to the robotic fulfillment centers, they are actually more likely to harm and injure human workers. And the reason for that is because humans are essentially being forced to kind of keep up with the machines in those more robotic warehouses versus like the less robotic warehouses. So while there's been a number of, I would say, promotional videos trying to make Amazon warehouses seem like an attractive employer. Like they've done all of these videos that were like, oh, look, the humans are collaborating with machines, and isn't this exciting and interesting? There's actually evidence that, the robotic warehouses are actually more dangerous for humans. So that raises the question of like whose lives matter, and what level of risk are we willing to accept, to get one day delivery. And so that matters from like a perspective of consumers, using, purchasing from Amazon. That matters from a perspective of workers, also managers, right? And just to quote again from this New York Times reporting, um, the steady stripping of human judgment from work is one of the most widespread consequences of automation. Not so much replacing people with robots as making them resemble robots. Really powerful quote, from that reporting.
Yes, really powerful. And I think we've had many cases, many studies done in the workplace where this is precisely what we've seen. And it's almost like going back to the industrial era 100 or so years ago with the first invention of the assembly line, when for the first time, perhaps you have the complete stripping of expertise from people, and making them just like a cog in a machine, rather than helping them do their work better,
Mhm.
which is a lot of the argument that we hear, right? That these technologies are going to make work just feel better for people, be more rewarding, and help them. But it does raise the question, who exactly is going to benefit and who is not? Right. Another aspect, another area of discussion in the book beyond the workplace, with the case of Amazon, is also, as you said, we shouldn't be thinking of technology as a separate thing in and of itself, and then society on the other side as a separate thing in and of itself, but rather it's a socio-technical system, and how that system works is very much dependent on how we affect it, right? What kinds of processes we put in place. And there's no other place, I guess I should say, more than the body in which this comes really evident, right? So the the technology in the human body integrated together, you introduce the term intimate infrastructure to kind of talk about that, right? So precisely to avoid this separation, we can talk about intimate infrastructure. So can you tell us more about that, and some cases, some examples of that?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for asking about that specific concept and that term in particular. So I can give maybe, let's say, two cases. Of course, there are many more, and you all probably have ideas about your own experience, potentially using technologies that are, related to the body and embedded in the body. So the first one, would be my own research and my own writing over the last 10 years, which I've done about, again, my experience using this insulin pump and sensor system. And, starting in 2018, the types of devices that were being offered on the market actually were claimed as smart devices or AI-driven devices. And the reason for this is that they use dynamic data from the sensor to administer insulin to the body, 24 hours a day in um, slight variations to the previous systems, meaning the previous systems we could understand as a linear system where at a certain time of day, your doctor would sort of help you set that previous kind of device, and it would give you a certain amount of insulin for all the hours between like 6 a.m. and noon. And then at noon, with together with your doctor, it would give you a different amount, right? So that was like the old system. But as the smart systems and the AI driven, models, at least that language being used, the AI was able to use the real-time data of the sensor to make slight adjustments that were not those that were necessarily determined by the doctor, but determined by the algorithm itself, right? So slight adjustments. I mean, these were not, not huge adjustments, but in order to make that particular system work, it required the human in the loop. So the human, our job as users was to continuously calibrate the sensor using another device called a blood glucose meter, where we would prick our finger, put the blood in the meter, and send that data to the pump. And that would allow, it would allow the pump to continue functioning, knowing that it had been calibrated together with like another device. So it's kind of like a triangulation of data, right? And this was important for legal reasons because, of course, manufacturers, want to be protected in case something goes wrong. So the idea that to have the human in the loop, and I think this is similar to other cases like airline pilots, like, there are many different systems that we use where either things are slightly more automated or less automated. Like I think airline pilots is one where I think everyone knows the story that, that the pilots are, working together with automated systems to like land the plane and things like that, right? In this case, the human is in the loop to do this work of testing the blood sugar, right? Now, the issue is over a 4-year period when I was using this device, the calibrations had to be taking place every 4 hours. And of course, if you want to sleep for 8 hours a night, that means you're being woken up several times a night. So for roughly 4 years, I was being woken up 2 or 3 days a week, multiple times a night, in order to calibrate the sensor. Not because I was having a medical emergency, but just to make sure that the system continued to function as it was supposed to be, right? So essentially in that case, it's a good one that shows like the power dynamics between the human and the machine. And in that case, I asked the question, am I taking care of the machine or is the machine taking care of me? So I think it really does reveal the intimacy, the kind of the almost like a dance, like that you're playing with, who's doing what at what time. But this particular model of system was, I would say, quite dehumanizing. Going for 4 years with like extreme sleep deprivation, resulted in like anxiety, stress, depression, not easy to do your job when you're living like that. I mean, it's akin maybe to having, someone wake you up in the middle of the night continuously, like if you have small children or a pet, or there's lots of reasons for that. So that's one case that I think does, where this concept of intimate infrastructures is like helpful for remembering that that machine has to is being used in the context of like different kinds of human activities. So it's one thing if you're just like sitting at home watching TV, you might be able to attend to the device. But if you're trying to sleep or you're at work and you have a very like busy job that requires a lot of attention, like your attention is going to be constantly pulled away to do these tasks to allow the machine to work. So that's one case. The second case I'll mention is not my own, but this is an example of discontinued bionic eyes. So there's a company called Second Sight Medical Products, and they were on the verge of going bankrupt in 2020. Over 350 blind people had their implants, and it was a very expensive device. It actually cost about $500,000 for both the device, the surgery, the rehab process, and some people found the device more distracting than it was enabling, so they would have just stopped using it. But for those that were continuing using it, essentially the device became completely unsupported when the company went bankrupt. So it's a really stark example of, what goes wrong when, when a company is inadvertently facing bankruptcy, and like what happens to the support of that device. Like, is there a handoff plan for how are these people going to be able to see if there's no possibility to continue the use of this particular device? Then are there other companies that provide this? What would it take to get one device removed and another put in, right? So that is just a very stark example of the harms that can occur, well, especially when we're talking about medical devices, and also, in this kind of business context. And yeah, someone put in the chat about 23andMe and the current bankruptcy, and that's exactly right, that we do have to think of these worst case scenarios. I'm pretty worried that the company that I use to live, insulin pump company, I'm pretty worried about their business. Like, what happens if their business is disrupted? What happens if there's supply chain issues? What happens if they have a new leadership, right? These are things that literally cross my mind.
Yeah, as they should, especially yes, with the very great example of 23andMe right now in front of everybody. But um, it kind of brings the point that, the intimate infrastructure that you're talking about is actually a private one. It's a private company with a individual, right, with a person. And infrastructures typically we think about as sort of government owned or government supported in some way. Typically, if there are roads, if there are, water infrastructures and so on. So this is something else that is being built, right? That are these intimate infrastructures, but they're in no way regulated or really in the public commons, right? So it is a scary thing, and it is one point was also brought up in the chat was that yes, you are now part of also not only the user but also part of the worker that is tuning this device, right? You're working for it as well. I'm amazed that you stuck with it for 4 years and that you went without, continuous sleep for so long. I would be just completely exhausted.
Well, it was obviously not by choice. Actually, your
Yeah.
insurance company decides when you are allowed to get new devices. And so because they're very expensive devices,
Hmm.
basically you have a 4-year window where you have to use that device until you can choose another
Yeah.
device. So it's
Yeah.
about the warranties. And so you really, in terms of agency to kind of change your mind, that you don't have a lot of agency in that particular example.
Yeah, that's a great point, because it might seem like you do because it's very much personalized to you and you're calibrating it to what you need. But in fact, you are subject to these, again, because it's not a common public infrastructure. It's something ruled by big private corporations.
Mhm.
So these are great examples. And I would love to continue thinking in this vein of intimate infrastructures. I think it's extremely productive, and it's also kind of different than what we hear a lot from the big tech titans out there that are imagining the kind of cyborgs that we think from, sci-fi movies, and talk about transhumanism and really creating these almost immortal beings that are going to go to Mars, or I don't know. So you're suggesting here an alternative way of thinking about this that is not at all based on implanting some devices that are going to make you superhuman, that are going to make you stronger, smarter, improve humanity. And that have been, these sorts of ideas have really been linked by Timnit Gebro and others to the eugenics movement, again, 100 years ago or more. So I really feel sometimes like we're kind of reliving the 1920s in many different ways, including this one.
Mhm.
So I want to talk next about cyborg culture. So, a lot, as we mentioned, sci-fi is one of the areas that, of course, cyborgs appear, but also in art exhibitions, in performances, in literature, in movies. So can you talk a little bit about cyborg culture and examples of that, and why do we celebrate it, and how do we celebrate it?
Sure. And I do wonder whether it might make sense to share some slides in this part just because a
Okay.
lot of the works are
Yeah.
visual. So let me just see if I can go ahead and do that without too much difficulty. Oh, that I don't, let's see, that's just part of a
We can,
slide.
yeah, we can see your screen.
Yeah, that's okay. Let me see if I can go from here. Is that now you see the okay. So one of the first works that I wanted to mention here is the work of VNS Matrix. And let me just scroll down in my notes as well. Okay. All right. So Specifically, this is a work in the early 1990s. The Australian cyber feminist art collective VNS Matrix, and they wrote a text called the Cyber Feminist Manifesto for the 21st Century, which was exhibited as a billboard in 1991. And they directly engaged with Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto. And to quote them, they say that they're on a mission to hijack the toys from techno cowboys and remap cyberculture with a feminist bent through a wide range of media, including zines, computer games, installations. VNS Matrix challenge existing understandings around women and technology, and in particular, question discourses of domination and control in the expanding cyberspace. They emphasize anti-reason rather than rational, disorder rather than order, material rather than symbolic, and the female body rather than the mind. And I mean, I think this does really pick up on, our last conversation about intimate infrastructures, because yes, rather than thinking about these like large scale technical systems, one of the arguments that I, again and again am trying to advance in my work is the idea that technology is imperfect, it's fragile, it breaks down, and that's not a bad thing. That's actually, that yes, we need to pay attention to that. And if we had a more public conversation around the kinds of fragility and breakdown that we see in everyday technical systems, then, I think we would be able to more accurately evaluate the social implications and the risks. But because we continue to talk about technology as kind of a savior as a solution, we are also not, accurately taking into account these alternative possible ways to think about technology and to design technology. The next work that I bring up, it's not a feminist work. However, in the 1980s, the Korean artist Nam June Paik produced these human form sculptures. So you can see that they look, this one in particular looks robotic. And his practice was discussed as what was called random access, working across traditional categories such as past, present, east, west, technical, spiritual, and creating these new kind of combinations and hybrids. And he was not particularly critical of technology. He was a little bit, a little bit more utopian and euphoric about technology. But he also did say like high tech is not a panacea. It's just a local anesthetic.
Mm.
Um, Another work that we talk about in the book is the work of Lynn Hirschman Leeson, who really was very early on doing a lot of work with even AI and gene editing. And she's quoted as saying, imagine a world in which there's a blurring between the soul and the chip, a world in which artificially implanted DNA is genetically bred to create an enlightened and self-replicating intelligent machine, which perhaps uses a human body as a vehicle for mobility. And then we talk about the work of Korean artist Lee Bull, who does this cyborg series. And she really does look into the ways in which our technologies continue to fail us. So Lee Bull writes with this piece, to keep their visions alive, humans label failed technologies as monsters, referring to Frankenstein's monster as a cyborg, an organism combined with technology that birthed new life, but it's called a cyborg because it was a failure. And then, I won't read too much more of that, but I just wanted to mention the work that I've collaborated with interdisciplinary artist Itziar Barrio, and the recent exhibition Did Not Feel Low Was Sleeping, which is actually, the title is actually drawn from my autoethnographic field notes about my own experience with the devices that I mentioned. And here you can see one of the robotic sculptures. So the data set that I transcribed from my device, which is about the ways in which the device gives alerts and alarms to wake me up, for example, are then used to automate the sculpture, which is made of cement and rubber. You can see, and there's kind of a writhing movement. And then the next aspect of that is just the ways in which the data set itself that I transcribed from the device is actually printed directly onto the circuit board. And, the reason that this is important is because this project really helped me think about, art is really approaching technology from a different perspective. And so it opens up potential conversations that are not being had, let's say, at a startup company. It's working with data in a very different way for the purpose of, activating the sculptures. And so I think that what excited me about, doing this more artistic collaboration was the ways in which I was able to then use that to continue thinking about critiques of technology. So it's this
Mhm.
critical and generative process of using, these physical objects out in the world to then make a commentary back about what kinds of futures of computing should we desire. And I developed this concept around data demons and thinking, it's not data doubles, these representations of the human that are talked about as, that companies are trying to kind of use to understand our behavior, but rather data demons, these artistic projects that kind of
Mhm.
dislodge or interrupt that logic of like efficiency, let's say.
Fantastic. I love data demons. And yes, we definitely need more artists engaging with this kind of work. And, there's been bioart is one vein as well, in which people are dealing with some of these questions. And also, of course, Afrofuturism, about which you also talk in the book, has had a long tradition of that kind of critique as well. So and imagining alternative futures. So being creative with the critique is a really great experience. So in conclusion, because we have about, I think, 5 minutes or so, you draw 10 principles of the cyborg perspective. So it's like a new cyborg manifesto, a response to Donna Haraway's from 40 years ago. Could you run us a little, if you remember all 10 of them, but if you don't, I can open the book and we can talk a little bit, what are the 10 principles of cyborg critical thinking?
Sure, I can share my slides again
Right.
because it might be the easiest way. Um, and I will just tell the 10 principles, and then if there are specific ones that you want to know more about, we can talk about that. So the first is cyborgs transgress boundaries. The second is cyborgs are situated. The third is cyborgs live in the real world. And the fourth is cyborgs celebrate the glitch. The fifth is cyborgs are infrastructural. 6, cyborgs take work. 7, cyborgs care for one another. 8, cyborgs speak a new language. 9, cyborgs are political. And 10, cyborgs cause trouble. So those are the 10 principles. And what I think what we tried to do, with the 10 principles is to kind of create, I guess it's a set of questions that one could ask the world or ask of different cases that you're trying to understand. Like if you were to read a news article about Amazon warehouses or the second site Bionic Eye or like the latest 23andMe example, these 10 principles might allow you to ask some questions about those cases. Like,
Mhm.
well, what kind of labor, who's doing the labor, what kind of maintenance is required to make the system work, so that we can continue to develop, again, this like critical cyborg literacy to help people be able to ask about the politics of technology. So really what we're trying to do is synthesize like a huge amount of different conversations that are taking place in across different fields in the scholarly, communities, but like synthesize them into a set of somewhat memorable, perhaps key points that can serve as a guide to anyone who wants to develop this kind of perspective on technology.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I think, the first one, that they transgress boundaries, is what makes them also political and what makes them trouble.
Mhm.
Right. And I think, we can talk about some of those boundaries. I think some of those you mentioned, technology society as separate, also body specifically and technology also as separate things. But do you want to also tell us a little more about the kinds of boundaries that cyborgs have questioned or really
Sure.
transgressed?
I mean, I think we can look at like gender binary, we can look
Mhm.
at able-bodied and disabled. I think that is one of the really powerful strengths of Donna Haraway's work is to, to continually introduce the fact that binary thinking, itself is perhaps not very useful, and that we can see in so many cases that the world does not map on to the boundaries that we have been perhaps organizing our knowledge around, for hundreds of years. Like that, the real world doesn't really work that way. And these are just the binaries themselves are constructs. So when cyborgs transgress boundaries, that allows us to make new kinds of knowledge, really ask different kinds of questions. So that, I think what is very tricky, maybe especially in the English language, is that we're thinking in binaries and we're talking in binaries. And when we sometimes have words that help us connect those things, sometimes the end result is that we tend to reify boundaries rather than to
Mhm.
think differently, because we keep getting trapped in the fact that our knowledge has been sort of shaped in these categories like mind versus body. And that's why the discussions around labor, like when we say AI versus humans, I just don't find to be a particularly useful conversation, right? Because if AI is socially constructed and itself made by humans, the values and the understandings of power are human, but yet we are still continuing to put things back into binary categories. So you'll see like a lot of best-selling books on technology where they just continue to reify boundaries when instead they should help us, to know what are these new configurations? What are these hybrid terms? And that's what Haraway's work has been good at helping us do. And thus, we need to invent these new languages that allow us to understand the world differently. And then also, I think using, again, like generative, using art and design, so many museums and galleries, when you walk in and you look at the work, the curator says, well, the great thing about this work is that it really helps to rethink these binaries that we have in society. So art either just tends to do that well, or curators tend to like to make that point when they show art, because the thing that makes art original and interesting is that it takes existing things and it recombines them in different ways. And so I think that's just kind of a jumping off point. I'm sure all of you here have lots of ideas about the ways in which our life can both reify boundaries, but also complicate boundaries.
Mm-hmm. And this is especially useful in the current times when we are, seems going backwards on reifying a lot of categories. And I think, we need categories as heuristics for dealing with the world, but also we need to always remember that we created those categories and we can also create new ones if we need them. And I think one of the dangers of especially predictive systems is that they do tend to reify categories. And once they're set in, very difficult to change, right? Once you train them on huge amounts of data that have binaries, or even if they're not just binaries, but they're essentially categories that we deal with today and may not be the same ones that we will need, tomorrow. It becomes a little more difficult. And so these cyborgs, this idea of constantly questioning is very good advice for developers as well, right? So don't forget, these things that you take for granted are not so set in stone as you might think they are. And then the next principle is it situated? And I think that's also extremely important. So beyond, questioning the categories that we're dealing with, it's also situational. So can you briefly talk about that as well? And, maybe you can juxtapose to some things that we sometimes, you know, reify in a different way. So in other words, it's not situated, but it's very abstract.
Right, exactly. I mean, so whenever we talk about things like data or AI, we're often talking about it in a way that, because we seem to give it this objective quality, it gets removed from the context or the situation. And of course, the thing that I think, sociologists and anthropologists and historians and designers do so well is that we look at situations where technology might be being used, and we look at the what is the human doing in these situations. So, I've conducted research in in hospital and medical settings. I've looked at, autonomous vehicle test beds. I've looked at, large scale wireless infrastructures. I've looked at my own experience with this medical device, as I said. And in every single of these examples, the situation that the technology is being used in is what the technology is fundamentally, right? So, like if the medical device is being used and while you're sleeping, it is technically, either a partner in that sleeping, or it's like kind of a disruptor of the sleeping. Or, with autonomous vehicles, like the test beds are these supposedly controlled atmospheres where cars drive around to kind of test these wireless communications. I mean, it depends on what type of specific autonomous vehicle you're looking at, but basically they're somewhat controlled environments. So they're out in the world, but there are no pedestrians, for example. So it matters if that a car is on the street in San Francisco or at the University of Michigan test bed. Like these are two very different situations. So I would say that, when we talk about context and situation, that it's about rejoining what are often talked about, these objective technologies, back to the social situation that they are in.
Yeah, and I think this is perhaps one reason that we've seen. I think we're seeing a lot of technology companies actually hiring now social scientists and humanities trained people such as linguists and historians, because they do recognize that technology is always entangled with the social world, and they don't know enough about that. So it's going to be very interesting to follow what happens from here on. I think we're close to our closing time. I want to thank you so much for this quick recap of everything. This is a great place to end, I think, today's book festival. This is the first book festivals we've had, and I hope to continue this tradition. I think it's very important to open the conversation for lay audience, for expert audience, for everybody to participate. And you're also a design researcher, which is a whole other topic that we could talk about, how design thinking figures into all of this. But it's essentially the same idea that we are all involved and we're all empowered to talk about these issues and not feel intimidated simply because it's technology, right? But technology is part of society, it's part of us. So thank you so much again. I will give the floor back to Mia, who probably will have some concluding words for us. And I would love to have you in one of our monthly reading webinars that
That
was
sounds great.
discussed as well. All right.
Thank you, Elena. And it's been such a great day. I was able to catch some of the earlier talks this morning, and it's just such a wonderful, like focused conversation. So thank you for being part of the organizing team.
Thank you. All right.